Welcome back, guys. So as you can tell from the title, what I'm going to be going over in this video are a couple books on the late Roman Empire. So I know we talk about this topic a lot, but it probably would be useful for me to go over a little bit of the literature. So if any of you guys watching this are interested in it and you want a place to start learning about it aside from my videos, or I don't know anyone else on YouTube that does late antiquity, although I'm sure there are some. But anyway, if you want stuff to actually read, then let's get going. So, the first guy I've got, and this is the biggest one, is Peter Heather's Empires and Barbarians. So, over the past, let's see, it's 2021. So, over the past, I don't know, 50 years, there's been a serious debate among academics who work on this topic of, well, in late antiquity, towards the end of the late Roman Empire, early medieval period, one of the main things that's happening, okay, is people are moving from the frontier regions and Central Europe more broadly, and then a little further east in Asia, and then Ireland and Scotland, or what's today's Scotland and Ireland, into the Roman Empire. There are people like the Franks, the Huns, the Avars, Goths, etc. The list goes on and on and on. There are groups coming out of North Africa and the Near East, whose names I can't remember. But a big question, a big problem is, well, that's happening. To what extent, though, is that actually happening? Like, how big are these groups? It's not necessarily all that clear. And given the problem of the primary sources, a lot of these people writing these sources are doing so for extremely biased reasons. They don't necessarily have all the correct information. They don't necessarily go to these places. Some of it's being framed in like Christian apocalyptic terminology. It's somewhat difficult to determine how many people were moving, and if we should even really consider that people moving around was a significant cause or factor in the end of the Roman Empire and the formation of medieval Europe. So, what Empires and Barbarians does is, and this is not strictly a work of history, this is one of those books which is transdisciplinary. So, Heather combines history, sociology, archaeology, anthropology, certainly migration studies, etc., to try and read the available evidence and reinterpret it and argue that migration was indeed a key part of what was going on here. So this doesn't just cover the late Roman Empire. This covers the late Roman Empire, and it goes up until like the year 1000 with the Viking invasions, the Holy Roman Empire. So if you want like a solid book that covers late antiquity into medieval Europe, this is what you want. That being said, though, let me be clear about something, and Heather himself is clear about this in the introduction. So, early medieval studies and late antique studies are two of those fields which have spawned 1,000,001 subfields, all of which are fairly specialized. So we have like Slavic studies, Viking studies, Carolingian studies, etc. Each one has their own attendant literature, their own issues, their own problems. In writing a book like this, Peter Heather is under no illusions that he's somehow mastered all of that literature. So, and this is especially true with the Slavic chunks of the book, he's very clear that he might have missed stuff. But I'm starting you out with this book because if you want to get a deep dive on who's moving, how do we actually determine these numbers, how should we read these primary sources, what are the problems in reading something like Jordanes, what are the inherent textual issues, this is where you want to start. Next up, I've got two. These are also both by Peter Heather, and they work together. So it would be best to read these like one after another. So the first would be The Fall of the Roman Empire, A New History of Rome and the Barbarians. And the other is The Restoration of Rome, Barbarian Popes and Imperial Pretenders. Okay, so in late antique studies, it is very fashionable, and there is some now, pushback against this, like these two books. It's fashionable to look at the Roman Empire as not a state that collapsed in fire and brimstone and death and destruction, because it didn't, not really. it's fashionable to look at it as a period of transformation from the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages. And that's not an incorrect perspective. There was a lot of continuity in between the two eras. There was a lot that carried over. The problem, though, is that maybe there's a little too much emphasis on the transition. It might be useful to reevaluate some of what's going on. Was this really a collapse? Was it really a transformation? And what role do the barbarians play? Nobody would argue that the barbarians come in, like Edward Gibbon says they do, and burn out the empire. Take it down militarily. Nobody argues that because it's not what happened. At the same time, though, the barbarians, quite possibly, had something to do with it. But what exactly? That's what Peter Heather is trying to figure out in The Fall of the Roman Empire. And he basically argues that, well, it's not necessarily any one group of barbarians, the Goths, the Franks, whatever, which caused the empire to fail. His general thesis is that it's the fault of the Huns. When the Huns come in, what happens is they create a centralized empire that's able to exert enough influence and power in Central and Eastern Europe to challenge the Romans in a frontier that they have never really been challenged before for that length of time. And it drives so many people into the Roman Empire that eventually cracks start showing. The Romans try to integrate as many of the barbarians as they can, but eventually it doesn't work. And eventually, when the Romans have to turn to the barbarians for help, well, the barbarians start becoming the new focus of power for the late Roman aristocrats, and gradually the empire splits up. Now, this leads into his next book, The Restoration of Rome, because what he's arguing here is, well, yeah, the Roman Empire disappeared in the West, but if you were to talk to people in like 476 when the Western Empire splits up politically, and you say the empire's gone, that doesn't mean anything to them, because the Roman Empire, that was the only power system that had existed in that part of the world for 500, 600, 700 years. That would be like an American waking up tomorrow with the U.S. gone, the federal government gone, but you still live in Iowa, you still live in Nebraska, you still live in New York. Everything in your local area is still happening. So what does that mean? To live in America that no longer exists? Doesn't mean anything. You wouldn't conceive of it in that way. You wouldn't be able to. The Romans don't conceive of it this way either. But they do know something is different. Something's missing. Something's absent. There is no political unification in the West anymore. Well, the point of the restoration of Rome is, okay, how do we get back to that? So he looks at a couple different empires, a couple different states which argue that they are successors to Rome. The Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric, the Frankish kingdom, first under the Merovingians and then under the Carolingians, and then eventually he goes into the development of the Roman Catholic Church and the impact that the church has in more ways than one. Because of the structure of the Catholic Church, this is really what preserves the Roman Empire. And although it doesn't exert power politically, it exerts power religiously. So those two texts, these two books, work excellent together, and that's how you should go about reading them. The next two books, and these are on the smaller side, these are two books by Peter Brown, the guy that basically is responsible for creating late antiquity as a field. This form of study of the late Roman Empire which focuses on religion, culture, continuity, etc. And the first is, well, the first one I have here would be The Cult of the Saints, Its Rise and Function in Late Antiquity. So what this book is doing is examining the, as the title suggests, the rise of the cult of the saints, which extends into medieval Europe. If you're a Catholic watching this, then to an extent, part of the form of Christianity you practice is very, very heavy on the role of the saints. This is where this begins. And it's through the rise of the saints that Peter Brown is doing two things. One is he's arguing against older philosophical trends for how we should view religion, and he's reshaping therefore our consciousness in the modern day for how we study this stuff, which is very useful. And the other is that he's examining the development of these spheres of public and private life. In the Cult of the Saints, when this is happening, in more ways than one, it's building on older Roman traditions of stuff like hero worship, and it's taking this idea of hero worship, applying it to saints, people that were martyred in the service of Christianity and sanctified by the church. And it's shifting their worship, their veneration, away from these specific shrines to cemeteries. This is something the Romans didn't do because that's private space. It's where the dead are. You just don't go there. Well, the rise of the Cult of the Saints starts changing this because it's changing the Romans' perspective and perception of space in the late Roman world. It's changing the culture, and thus gradually we start to see the impact of Christianity coming down from up high down to lower levels, and local aristocrats and other notables get involved with Christianity partially in this way. The other book, The Making of Late Antiquity, this is a series of essays given by Peter Brown in about 1978, and it's all about how late antiquity develops as a field. It's fairly self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into too much detail with it. The next two books, and these are both two textbooks. So the first is The Roman Empire from Severus to Constantine, and the other would be Stephen Mitchell's A History of the Later Roman Empire. So this, because it's red, this is the older edition of the book. There is now a newer one. It's green, I believe. But basically, they are doing exactly what they set out to do. The Roman Empire from Severus to Constantine traces a broad political history of about the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. It doesn't go into the end of the Roman Empire, but it's fairly heavy on political history and military history. And there's a little bit of Christianity, but it's very useful for getting a baseline for everything going on. You should read this one to get a political spine for the period, and then go into other books on specific subjects, because this will give you something in your mind to attach everything else to. A History of the Later Roman Empire is a generalized textbook on late antiquity, but it's useful because it's the best one that I've come across so far that really tries to integrate a lot of the secondary literature into what it's talking about. And it's broken up into, as textbooks usually are, multiple different sections. The evidence for the late Roman Empire, what the term late antiquity means, how it develops. There's a narrative chapter, 2 narrative chapters actually, for providing a political spine to attach everything to. And then we get more specialized focus chapters, military history, the impact of the barbarians, the rise of Christianity, and the transition to the medieval period. Second to last here is Peter Brown's The Rise of Western Christendom. So this covers Western Europe between about 200 and about 1000. So there are tons of books on the late Roman Empire, like we've gone over in this video so far. But this book, this is the one where if you want a single one-shot take of what happens in terms of not necessarily military history, but political, social, and religious history, how the Roman Empire disappears and then how Europe arises into the medieval period, this is probably the best thing you should read. This is it. The only downside is it's a little expensive, but it's Peter Brown, so it's not only highly readable, it kind of flies by as you turn the pages, but the depth of his learning is just immense, and you will come away with this with a very solid foundation for late antiquity. And the last book we're going over here, personally I like to think I saved the best for last, because we all like military history, would be Bishop and Colston's Roman Military Equipment from the Punic Wars to the Fall of Rome. It's exactly what it sounds like. This is a general survey of all the archaeology, well, not all the archaeology, a decent chunk of the archaeology, a lot of the textual and artistic evidence for Roman military equipment for most of Roman history, excluding the early chunk of the Republic and the monarchy. But it's broken down nicely into distinct chapters which focus on not only the swords and the armor, but the spears, the artillery, the belts, the clothing, food. So if you're into reenacting or you just want to learn more about Roman military equipment in general, this is what you need. This is absolutely what you should start with. So guys, that was a brief look at some books. Hopefully you found it useful. If you have any specific questions about anything else, let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you. So until the next video, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you all next time.